The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, the final episode in our series, Forgotten War, where we talk Canada's war history and unpack our place on the global stage. Then, author Ted Barris introduces us to the Canadians who fought in the Battle of Britain. That's ahead on The Agenda. From the trenches of Korea to the Turkish invasion of Cyprus and the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, our series, Forgotten War, has detailed these post-World War II conflicts through the eyes of Canadian veterans who were there.
And we were getting pretty close to their line when our sergeant said, "Stop, we're in the middle of a minefield."
Just as I was going down, Plouffe was hit by a bullet. It went through his helmet and through his mouth. So when I arrived there, he opened his mouth and he had the bullet, on his tongue. And we start laughing, crazy, how you react in those circumstances.
You get into a observation post or a position where they're aiming an RPG at you, and do you have to wait till we have effective fire to fire back? I mean, there won't be anything left to fire back if that thing goes off.
These interviews raise a number of questions. Do Canadians know much, if anything, about this history? Has our peacekeeping past become more myth than reality? And in 2024, has Canada lost its place on the world stage? Joining us now for more on that, in Chelsea, Quebec, Carrie Buck. She's the former Canadian ambassador to NATO and senior fellow at the University of Ottawa. And with us here in our studio, Timothy Sale, professor of history and director of the International Relations Program at the U of T, author of Enduring Alliance, A History of NATO and the Post-War Global Order. And Arne Kislenko, who's a professor of history at Toronto Metropolitan University. And it's great to have, Arne, you back here. Timothy, you here for the first time. And former Ambassador Buck, great to have you on the line, joining us as well from Points Beyond. Great to see you again, too. I want to start with this question. I want all three of you to weigh in on this. Arne, we'll have you go first. My sense is we know a decent amount about the history of our military involvement in World War II. How would you characterize what Canadians know, Arne, about our post-World War II military engagements?
Well, to be succinct, virtually nothing. I come right out of the gate saying honestly that I don't think we pay virtually any attention to that, certainly not in a lot of classes that I'm familiar with, nothing directly. And in part it's because I think the narratives are quite different, right? Canada's service in places like Korea, those Canadians that volunteered for Vietnam, our engagements later in the 1990s, they didn't fit the narrative of sort of clean victory, of morally and ethically correct wars. They were nasty in a lot of ways, politically nasty as much as anything else. And I think Canadians maybe are innately uncomfortable with that, particularly where we weren't peacekeepers, as the myth goes. So I think they're really largely neglected. That's been my experience on the front lines as a professor in the proverbial trenches, but also just in general with the Canadian public. I don't think we pay any attention to that sort of stuff.
Carrie Buck, what's your take on that?
Well, I think the stories we tell ourselves about what Canada does internationally on the military front have shifted over time. I agree that the history isn't well known in detail, but we do have a national narrative. So I think in the beginning, it was about Canada and Canadians seeing themselves as a middle power that punched above its weight. And that's the two world wars, and I'd add Korea to that. But then this shifted when peacekeeping was introduced, and classical, easier, kind of more neutral peacekeeping. We saw ourselves as an honest broker and a peacekeeping nation. And I think that shifted again over time. I think today's narrative is slightly different. We understand the world's more complex, and when we deploy to those complex, pretty violent environments like Afghanistan, overall there's, largely majority Canadian support for that. It waxes and wanes over the course of deployment. So I think those narratives about who we are internationally have shifted over time.
Timothy Sale, what say you?
I agree generally that Canadians don't know too much about this military history after the Second World War. I think people have a sense, maybe depending on their generation, of a few key peacekeeping moments. But there's not a lot of awareness of what the Canadian military was doing for these decades and decades after the Second World War. And I think that's a shame because even when those forces were not deployed as part of peacekeeping operations or other military operations, they were still serving a purpose and they were still shaping the world they live in. And so Canadian military operations after the Second World War, I think, have shaped our world more than Canadians realize.
Aaron, tell me if I'm reading too much into this, but the United States, a country born out of a revolution which has been mythologized and reported on, and historians have really dug their teeth into that over decades and decades. Our country got started because of an act of the British Parliament. Not quite the same in terms of myth-making. Does that mean we've got something missing from our cultural or historic DNA, which therefore leaves us a bit on the sidelines when it comes to knowing what we're talking about here?
I think so, for sure. I think Canadians generally are always kind of prone to defining themselves in the not being American context. And in a lot of ways, that celebration of military history, rightful as it may be in the United States, strikes some Canadians as being a bit excessive, as being sort of nationalistic, maybe too patriotic. I always, joke with my students that when they go abroad for the first time, they'll carry a very small Canadian pin as opposed to a big flag on their backpack, right? So I think Canadians are innately uncomfortable with what they may see as kind of, overdoing it in that sense. And that may be part of our DNA as we downplay our role militarily. I would just argue that we do it so thoroughly that a lot of Canadians, even in classes that are about the First and Second World War, which both Tim and I teach, are sometimes shocked to hear about how Canada had its own beach at D-Day or how it had the two largest ports in the Second World War. And that's where I think we've become too prone to that tendency. Yeah.
Carrie Buck, when you were the ambassador, did you sometimes feel you didn't have the DNA that, the American ambassador or the French ambassador or British ambassadors had because of the histories of their country compared to ours?
Well, okay, history hits us in that we're not on the Security Council. So, we don't act and think like the US, the UK, or the Brits, for sure. But, I don't think that we are totally ignorant or totally uncomfortable with the notion that we deploy military forces abroad in a way that's sometimes dangerous. And that can have a pretty serious, usually positive impact on the state of the world. I think Canadians have been comfortable with that persona earlier, as I said, right after the wars. And I think that we've been comfortable periodically, for instance, with the Afghanistan deployment, with the idea that, we'll engage militarily, and we'll engage militarily in places where Canadians might get hurt.
The origin story, Timothy, does that affect the way we look at things?
I think it's a malleable story that changes. I think that Canadian history shows that Canadians will rally, will fight when their leaders ask. So I see it less of a cultural DNA situation and more a political situation where leaders don't see a benefit in describing Canada to Canadians in this way.
Mind you, when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister, he put the Royal back in some of our institutions. Does that suggest he was a little more on the ball on this than others?
Well, I think that if you're to look over the last couple of decades and look at political leaders from both parties, you'll see in the actual funding to the defense, it has been on the downswing, and I think you need to look at the dollars.
Follow the money, right? That's what
right.
Woodward and Bernstein said, follow the money. Let's look at a clip here. We have been rolling out this series called Forgotten War. This is from episode 1. We're going to introduce you to a guy named Romeo Daly. He's 19 and he volunteers to go to Korea. Think about that. Think about the 19-year-olds you know today and whether they would simply go halfway around the world to volunteer to take part in a war. I mean, it's astonishing. And he's one of the first Canadians sent to a mobile army surgical hospital after being hit by a grenade. Sheldon, roll it if you would.
When I came home, got on a train in BC, went to Toronto where my mother lived. When I got to Union Station in Toronto and I got off the train, hit the platform, there was my mother. No military, nothing. The Canadian government did not treat us well. We wanted a volunteer medal for Korea. Canadian government says no. We said, you've got thousands of volunteer medals in Ottawa from the Second World War. Can't give them to you. Why not? That'll insult the Second World War soldiers.
Now, this is more than 60 years ago, and you can tell he is still, can I say this? He is still pissed at the treatment he received all those decades ago. Why did we not take that military engagement seriously in this country?
Do you mean the Korean War in particular? I think because it was distinctly not part of this narrative of Canada being neutral and kind of a middle power. That was early in the stages of that development. But, you know, we were Cold Warriors. And I think often Canadians maybe aren't comfortable with that or don't know that. But the entire history, not just Korea, but moving forward, Canada was a very strong ally. It served, of course, in major multilateral organizations like NATO, often, you know, very close to the American position on things. And it was a really nasty war. And, of course, it's a war that led to the most Canadians that were killed in combat outside of the First and Second World War. And it's not a clean narrative, especially when the end result of Korea is still with us, a divided
it kind of ended in a tie, didn't it?
It ended in a tie, and in a horrific one, to be blunt. So I think it's uncomfortable. But I did want to point out, I watched all the clips that I was sent about this great series, and that is a common theme. A lot of the veterans from Korea moving forward have that sense of being forgotten, of being alienated in a very personal sense. And I think that's something that maybe as Canadians we need to really fundamentally address out of respect.
Well, okay, let's follow up on that. Timothy, why do you think we need to remember the events of more than 60 years ago today?
Well, the Korean War has shaped our world for the Cold War era and still today. We have to remember that it was because of this Korean War, so this conflict really on the other side of the world from Canada, that Canada ended up sending forces to NATO Europe in the early 1950s. So the fact that we'd have Canadians in Europe for decades, and now, of course, with NATO today, that commitment, those institutions, they were all shaped by the Korean War. So it's a hugely important part of understanding that whole post-war era and our world today.
Kerry, I don't even think we called it a war back then, and sometimes when I look at monuments, it doesn't say Korean War, it says Korean conflict. Does that suggest a continuing lack of respect for the people we sent over there to fight on our behalf?
I don't think, well, first off, I'm not a historian and I wasn't alive during the Korean War. Well, actually the war continued, so I suppose it was. But so I can't really look at it from a historical perspective, but I do think it's part of that almost binary approach we take, in that when we deploy internationally, there'll be public support for it. And that does go back to politics and political leadership, I think. There will be public support for it. And no doubt there was for the Korea deployment at the time. But at the same time, our national narrative, while we'll admit that sometimes we'll go abroad in robust military deployments, for the most part, we do see ourselves as a more peaceable country. And so maybe that's the reason why, not a justification, we don't have the big fanfare that over the U.S. history, for instance, returning vets were usually accorded.
Timothy, can I get you on that, Timothy? The notion that we didn't call it the Korean War, call it the Korean conflict. Does that suggest a lack of respect for the sacrifices made by those who participated?
I think it reflects when that war happened. It was 5 years after the end of the Second World War. War was unpopular. It was called a police action at the time. President Truman lost his job in the United States over this war. It was deeply unpopular at the time. So politicians, leaders at the time were trying to avoid describing this as a war. There was talk of possible use of atomic weapons. It was an awful war, as Arne said. So from its origins, really, the Korean War has been sort of swept under the rug in a way, and I think we're still dealing with that legacy today.
This is, Arne, the classic historian's question, so here goes. Do you think there are consequences to us as a country if we don't know about this stuff?
That's my whole life. That's my job description in life right there. Absolutely. And, you know, it really angers me as I get older and older. I lose patience because I feel like we historians have to justify why we exist, as if history is some sort of trivial pursuit or quaint little hobby that you might have. And it's outrageous, frankly. We live in a country where, the pains of history are very evident to some people, First Nations people, for example. So I don't know why we need reminders that history everywhere is really powerful. There are multiple narratives and great debates to be had. But if you don't understand your history, you don't appreciate it, or God help us all, you totally ignore it, absolutely, as some people do, that is going to be a major problem. You have no ability to listen, to understand other people. And history doesn't repeat itself. I don't agree with that old, cliche.
But it does.
But there's rhyme. Yeah, there's rhyme.
It rhymes, it
and in
echoes.
that case, it behooves me why people sort of trivialize it. Especially if you just shook your own family tree, as I always say to my students. Stuff comes out that helps identify you as a person. Now do that on a national scale, where all of us have narratives. We need narratives. All nations cultivate narratives and myths to boot. So, imagining, that this is on and listen, who do they turn to when the world goes to hell? You bring on historians to make sense of the Russian invasion of Ukraine or whatever. So, of course, I think it's the most important thing ever, but what do you expect coming from a historian?
Well, I do expect that answer.
Yeah.
That's good. But let me follow up with you in that regard. Do you think we have, I don't know if responsibility is the right word, but an obligation, I don't know what, as a citizen, to kind of understand this better? Because illiberal democracies, leaders of illiberal democracies all over the world, and hopefully not to the south of us, all over the world, use history for their own authoritarian purposes. And am I going too far by saying if we understand this and know this better, we might not be under the throes of that kind of authoritarianism?
I agree. That's right. When a leader gets up and says, this is our history, this is our past, it's our destiny too, what are we supposed to make of that? That has a very strong pull on humans, I think, to be told this is a connection with history. But we need to be able to gauge whether it's actually true. And so we need to have the context. We need to have the understanding of our past, I think, to immunize ourselves in a way against leaders who tell us, well, this is our history, this is our future.
Part of our history is peacekeeping. Most Canadians, I think, know about that, and we want to do a little exploring on that front right now. Let's start with this quote from author Dan Gardner, whom we've had on this program many times, good guy, who writes, "We Canadians love to see ourselves as the world's peacekeepers. Our soldiers wear blue berets, not helmets. They carry binoculars instead of rifles. They don't take lives, they save them. War and killing the enemy is for Americans. Peace and protecting the weak is the Canadian way." That's Dan Gardner on his website. Let's do a clip now. Sheldon, if we can, let's roll. This is Sandra Perrin, Canada's first female infantry officer. She was deployed in the Balkans to both Bosnia and Croatia in the early 1990s. Roll it if you would.
Our mandate to keep peace when peace did not exist was very challenging. What peace is there to keep when they're firing each other and we're stuck in the middle with big white vehicles that have basically targets on them?
UN troops were also limited by the rules of engagement. They could fire only if they were directly fired upon.
When you get into a observation post or a position where they're aiming an RPG at you, and do you have to wait till we have effective fire to fire back? I mean, there won't be anything left to fire back if that thing goes off.
That's another excerpt from Forgotten War. We encourage everybody to go to our website and find that, Forgotten War. Google it. It's well worth watching. Carrie Buck, going to start with you on this round here. How do you think we should understand this country's peacekeeping history?
Well, it makes some sense that our national narrative focuses on what I'll call classical peacekeeping. Those deployments where there's already a peace to keep, you've got lightly armed troops deployed, and they're only allowed to use force in self-defense. But in the history of peacekeeping, there were, that was a relatively... It was a period where I think there were about 13 missions, and it's a period that shifted a number of decades ago. And I think that Bosnia, Somalia, Rwanda, those larger scale peacekeeping missions were part of a second wave, a second generation of peacekeeping that was in much more complex environments where troops were deployed when guns were still firing and there was no peace to keep. And these much more complex deployments required not just military, but governance experts, human rights experts, deminers, people who could help restore justice, negotiate peace. And to be honest, those in the early 90s, the latter half of the 20th century, those UN missions overstretched, they overreached, and they weren't as successful as the earlier expectations had hoped.
Timothy, going to follow up with you on that. To the extent we have any myth-making in this country as it relates to our military, it's about peacekeeping. More myth than reality in your view?
Well, peacekeeping is a reality, but it's a proportion or a portion of Canada's reality in the post-war era. These missions occurred. They were very important for Canada on the world stage, for the people and the places that peacekeepers were sent. But they're just a fraction of what the Canadian military was doing as a part of NATO, as a part of NORAD. And so I appreciate that we recognize the history of peacekeeping, but I think we need to put it in relationship to Canada's broader military efforts in the post-war world.
Well, let's do a little comparing and contrasting here, Arne. Okay, we talked about Korea already. If we go back to the 50s and 60s, we're talking about our engagement in Egypt, in the Suez Crisis, the Middle East. We talk about Lester Pearson, who became prime minister based on a heck of a successful run as the foreign minister, Nobel Prize winner. In Cyprus, we've got the largest contingent of troops in the United Nations there. You know where we're at today. What was Canada's role in the world? How were we seen back then?
Well, we were seen as a sizable power in a lot of ways, not just sort of by the United States and our predictable partners, but also by other nations in the world, right? Canada played a significant role in things like the ICC and the International Control Commission in Indochina, which failed, but Canada was hunted out for that role. We did receive a lot of attention having, Lester Pearson win the Nobel Peace Prize, and that's where that myth, I think, really took weight. And we did, if I'm not mistaken, I think something like 10% of UN forces, peacekeeping forces, were Canadian at the height. So, there is truth to that myth. The problem is, as Tim points out, is that it is really a narrow slice. If you talk to any generals, I've had the great pleasure of meeting and talking and reading a lot of generals, and some of them are pretty categorical. They say peacekeeping is a sideline.
A sideline?
A sideline, that it's not really what the Canadian military is designed to do. It's not what it has done. That's evidence of things like Korea. And even in these stabilization, I think is the better term than peacekeeping, the stabilization roles they played in the former Yugoslavia, it was ugly. There were serious combat moments. So this is where that myth kind of falls apart. Canada has been, and I think frankly should be, designed with real military engagements in mind. Not that peacekeeping isn't, because people die in peacekeeping. So that's where I'm not going to say it's an absolute myth and it's totally contrived. But the reality is that Canada has had far more serious military obligations, and that's where that myth becomes slightly dangerous. We imagine ourselves to be peacekeepers when we have other obligations and other roles to play.
There was this expression that we used to hear a great deal, Timothy, saying that Canada was one of those countries that punched above its weight when it came to international affairs decades ago. They don't say that about us anymore, but they did back then. Was it accurate?
That's right. Yes, absolutely. There was a period, and especially when we think about Canada's great diplomats being on the world stage, you've mentioned Lester Pearson, and the fact that Canadians were listened to. But it wasn't just because those diplomats were smart and had wise ideas. It's because Canada was also making a real contribution on the military side of things. So there were Canadian forces deployed abroad in Europe, around the world, peacekeeping, yes, but also in NATO, and that is what gave strength to the Canadian voice on the world stage. So you can't just have the diplomacy without the battalions to back it up.
Let's continue on this line of inquiry because we want to show another excerpt now from Forgotten War. And we want to introduce you to Major General Alain Forain, who was awarded the Star of Courage in 1974 for his actions in Cyprus. We're going to play a clip and come back and chat. Sheldon, if you would, the clip.
Forain believes the Canadian Armed Forces can still play an integral role in stabilizing the world, much as they did in Cyprus. But he sees an under-resourced military that is not what it once was.
I don't see the future, being rosy. That's unfortunate. The world is here, it's surrounding us. So if problem arise somewhere, it will have an impact on us eventually. And if you're not able to try to help them, then that problem will become yours at one point or another, whether you like it or not.
Before I ask you guys a question, what a chest full of medals, eh? Was that something? That guy's been around. He has seen the world. I remember we used to have a guest on this program named Matthew Fisher. He was the longest-serving foreign correspondent for Canadian news service ever in Canadian history. Died, I guess, a few years ago. And he used to have this line. He'd say, there is no country in the world that does less and says more than Canada. He did not mean it as a compliment. Timothy, is he right?
I think we're actually saying less and less as well as doing less and less on the world stage. And it feels like we're frozen in a way. What is Canada's position on some of these great issues of the world? War and peace. So I think we're doing less. It seems like we're saying less. And I think governments maybe are even saying less to Canadians now about what is our role here? What can we do in the world?
How does that quote sound to you, Arn?
It might be a little bit excessive, to be honest with you. I think Canada still has a very important role to play. We can regain it. That's the way that I would sort of frame it more optimistically. And I think Kerry's right. Like, we forget that Canadians served with absolute distinction in Afghanistan, as messy and as horrible and, not the right conclusion for most Canadians as it was. Our armed forces, when called upon, have been excellent. They've been spectacular, and we should never forget that. That really troubles me that we do. And that includes right down to the rank and file, all those men and women serving. And of course, our commanders in the field, they did a great job. So we can get back to that place, because the world, do I need to tell you this, Steve, that the world isn't very nice sometimes.
You don't say.
It's not very pleasant. And I think Canadians suffer from this idea that somehow we can get through it without those commitments that we have, not just to NATO. NATO's top of the mind, given its impact, but also to ideas, human rights, for example. Like, when the next country goes to hell, Canadians will scratch their heads and say, we should do something about it. My students do it all the time. We should intervene. And I always really uncomfortably point out, what do you mean by intervention? Are you personally going to go? No, you're going to send armed forces. And now we're in a position where they are terribly equipped, where we have a critical shortage, right, of recruits, like something like 16,000 short, I think, is the latest stats. And we don't even do the peacekeeping, as Kerry pointed out. I think, if I'm not mistaken, there are like 27 peacekeepers. So our commitments to NATO and deployment in places like Latvia today are significant, but we're asking them, and we'll probably ask them in the future, to do a job that we're not actually prepared to provide them with the tools. And that's outrageous.
Kerry Buck, in light of the events of last week, there's a new president coming in the United States, and I wonder whether, what kind of role do you think Canada can play in the world while it tries to figure out its relationship with the new president?
Well, I think that compared to the first term, President Trump's second term will be much more predictable, much more isolationist, and likely more damaging. I think to the key institutions and the alliances that we've relied on since, the beginning of Canada, the guardrails and the gloves are off. So where does that leave us? What can we do? In our bilateral relationship, we have to be pragmatic, deepen our use of donut diplomacy, where we use all the levers at our disposal across the country, across governments, private sector, to deal with their counterparts, to squeeze Washington, to do what's in Canada's interest. It's going to be much, much harder. Then on the global front, what can we do? Well, honestly, we can't do a lot to constrain or even mold where a Trump presidency would go on the global stage. But I would argue that we need to, I'll be less than diplomatic. We need to grow up a bit. We need to redefine our own kind of strategic sovereignty, do a conscious exercise to define what our assets are and what our vulnerabilities are under a Trump presidency, and then work to diversify. What are our assets? We actually are trusted. There was an Ipsos poll last year saying what country in the world will do the most good over the next decade, and Canada was number one for 80% of the people across 30 countries. That's an asset for us, right? So those are our assets, but our vulnerabilities are worse with the Trump presidency. I'd start with the Arctic and climate security to begin with. We should be diversifying our security relationships, building an Arctic pillar in NATO, working more with our Arctic allies, for instance, to help to mitigate our over-reliance on the U.S. that we've bred over, decades, and reinvest in diplomacy and defense.
Must confess, I've never heard that expression, donut diplomacy, before, but it feels appropriately Canadian to use. Exactly right. Well done. Well done. Let's follow up on that. Arn.
Yeah.
New Trump administration 2.0 coming in. What do you see for us?
Well, Trump's whole thing is to be unpredictable, right? So I guess we can be predictably unpredictable when you talk about Trump. He's made it pretty clear that he has dismal views on NATO in particular, and on everybody not contributing to it. So I think front and center, we're going to hear about that. And Canada's going to have to up its game in that respect regardless. But I couldn't agree more with Kerry. Like, we have our own strategic objectives. The Arctic seems to me to be top of that list. And Canada should be proverbially muscling up in respect of its own defense and security interests regardless of Trump.
Go buy a dozen new subs? Does that sound like a good plan?
I know it's complicated. And of course, once you talk about procurement issues, everybody starts talking about social welfare programs. And I totally understand that. Like, this is the reality of being Canadian, being a democracy. But here comes the pointy stick of history and contemporary international relations. It's an ugly world. And Canada does, by its own regard, have interests and obligations, including outside of Canada, to help people in the world. And we cannot possibly do that without procurement. We're not equipped. Our armed forces are suffering in so many ways. And it is very political. Kerry's very deft at handling it because of her former position. But it's a political stick.
I don't know. She said grow up.
Grow up is great.
Yeah.
Like, that would be, I'd say something probably even worse than that. But that's the reality. I know it's not savory for everybody, but we need to actually understand the world in which we inhabit this space and the roles and obligations we have. And at the end of the day, that is going to require us to beef up our military.
Timothy, what do you see?
I see that there's no place to hide for Canada. So there's no hope of just keeping our head down and everything will be fine. So instead, it's facing and cooperating with, working with the United States and thinking of the United States as a longtime ally of Canada. How can we work with the United States rather than personalizing the relationship? I think that's going to be key. But when it comes to procurement, and if Canada's going to spend more money on defense, then there needs to be a national conversation. There needs to be national leadership. This isn't something that you can do behind closed doors. Canadians need to be brought on board with this and understand why they're going to be paying the costs of these expensive new platforms, if that's what's going to happen.
Got a couple of minutes left here, and let me ask each of you for, 30, 40 seconds on this. Admittedly, a bit of a touchy-feely question, but what do you think we need to remember from our Canadian military historic past, if that's not redundant to say, I suspect it is, that can help us navigate our way through what is an increasingly, I was going to use a word, but I will not, let's just say screwed up world today. Carrie Buck, you want to start on that?
Oh, that's a $6 billion question. I think we can, I don't want us to have a nostalgia about the past, but I think if we could inject into our national conversation that sense of pride about what we've achieved with deployment of our military and I'd say diplomatic assets, what we've achieved internationally that isn't all about us being a Boy Scout and helping others. It walks straight back to our national interest, because what happens abroad, bad things that happen abroad, unless they're resolved or contained, they hit us. They hit our security and they hit our economy directly. The Russian invasion of Ukraine should have taught us that. So I'd like us to remember that it matters to our interests and, yes, our values when we deploy abroad, militarily and diplomatically, and that we can make a difference. And we have made a difference in our history.
Timothy.
I would like Canadians to remember that peace is expensive. So Canada spent a lot of money during the Cold War to maintain relatively large military forces so that they wouldn't have to fight. And so recognizing now in a very complicated world, it might be very expensive for us to remain not at war.
Freedom isn't free. That's the line I hear. Freedom is not free. Arn put a bow on it for us.
Listen, I'm a big fan of nostalgia in this particular case. Canada fought, not all the time and in every instance, but we fought on the right side of history, particularly in the Second World War. And Canadians need to remember that the institutions and ideas that we have today, as corny as it sounds, were paid for. And I don't know why we're so uncomfortable saying, oh, you know, because they were a different generation, no, they paid for it. A lot of them paid for it with their lives, and they helped us build institutions and ideas that we now represent globally. So when Canadians talk about human rights overseas, remember that we actually do defend them, and there may be an occasion where we have to defend them. So I'm a big fan of being nostalgic. We have to be open and honest about it all. But I would use the phrase "make Canada great again," except it's been rather tainted in the last few years.
I don't think you can use that.
We can regain our authority and our respect. And I think Canada should strive to that, no matter who's in government.
Let me just take 20 more seconds to say it is November 11th, but we are not wearing poppies, and we want to explain that because some people will wonder, why aren't we on Remembrance Day wearing poppies? And the answer is because when you go to a ceremony at 11 o'clock in the morning, after it is over, you are supposed to take your poppy off and leave it at the monument there, leave it at the wall, leave it at the obelisk, whatever. So by the time the evening comes, we are poppyless. That's the explanation. That was a great discussion, you three. We do have our shot there. Carrie Buck, our former NATO ambassador in the National Capital Region, let's say, in Chelsea, Quebec. Arne Kislenko from Toronto Metropolitan University. Timothy Sale from the University of Toronto. Thanks so much, you three.
Thank you.
If you are a history buff of a certain age, you will remember this quote. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill said that about a relatively small number of Royal Air Force fighter pilots who pushed back the best the Nazis had to offer in one of the most important battles of World War II. And, as he so often does, author Ted Barris chronicles the Canadians who fought. In his new book, Battle of Britain, Canadian Airmen in Their Finest Hour. And we're delighted to welcome Ted Barris back to TVO. How you doing, my friend?
It's a pleasure to be back with you.
Okay,
Thank you.
what number is this? That's my first question for you every time you come here. What number?
22.
This is your 22nd book.
Yeah.
You are insane. But I'm glad. It's a good insanity.
It is. It's an incredible journey into lives of great Canadians whom we've forgotten.
Amen. Well, let's not forget them during the next 20 minutes or so of
Okay.
this conversation. We're going to start with the basics. The Battle of Britain took part when?
July the 10th, 1940 to October the 31st, Halloween 1940, 113 days.
Why did it happen?
Well, Hitler, by the spring of 1940, occupies all of northwestern Europe. Poland has fallen in 39, Norway and Denmark early in 40. The defeat of the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the fall of France in June sets the stage for his final domino to fall, the invasion of England. He plans on or about September the 15th, 1940. But before that happens, he says to Hermann Goering, clear the sky over Britain of the RAF, erase it before we invade, with 260,000 German troops, 30,000 vehicles and 60,000 horses, and occupy London within 3 days. That's the plan. And it's the job of the RAF and some of the Canadians in it to thwart that.
How many British RAF fighters took part in the Battle of Britain?
British, 2,500. There were 147 Poles. There were 101 New Zealanders. There were 87 Czechs, 7 Americans, and 300 Canadians.
300 Canadians. Why were they there?
Well, they got there by circuitous routes at different times in the 1930s. A little more context. In Canada, after the Great War, the war to end all wars, Canada began to trim back on Air Force. In fact, one of the ministers in Borden's government post-World War I says, there's no need for aviation in peacetime. That's a wartime thing. And in contrast to Canada's trimming back our Air Force, essentially demobilizing airmen who'd fought wonderfully in the First World War, Canadian airmen in the Royal Flying Corps, and eliminating budget and so on, civilian aviation is taking off. Everybody wants to have that romance of flight like Amelia Earhart or, Charles Lindbergh. All those names were iconic. And if you could fly on your own on a weekend or whatever, everybody wanted a private pilot's license in Canada. So there was that kind of groundswell, grassroots thing going on, and the trimming back of the official Air Force. And while we were trimming back, the RAF was recognizing in the early 30s, war is coming again, and they need pilots. So they hang that carrot out there across the Commonwealth, and they say, if you're a young man, you have a private pilot's license, why don't you try to join the RAF, make your own way here, we'll test you, and we'll give you a direct entry scheme into the RAF, become an officer in mid-1930s. Who wouldn't take that?
So some of them were RAF fighters, but not all of them, right? There was
No.
another group that came later.
That's right.
Who were our guys.
Finally, after, let's just finish the guys who straggled in on their own. About 118 Canadians took that carrot, jumped on cattle boats with those private pilots' licenses, get the direct entry scheme, and become commissioned officers. And in return, they have to give 6 years service. We'll do the math. You arrive in 35, by 1939, you're front lines. Now, with the war breaking out in 39, King has the convenience, Prime Minister Mackenzie King has the convenience of saying, we're going to be training aircrew in Canada because it's safe. No conscription, no casualties. We're not interested in sending squadrons, but by the time the war breaks out, the RAF is desperate. And so Canada sends its first RCAF, number 1 fighter squadron, about 100 pilots and about 200 ground crew into the battle.
Did they do that because Prime Minister Churchill asked Prime Minister King for them?
No, because when Churchill asks King initially for the assistance and endorses the idea of training aircrew here, the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, about which I wrote a book 30 years ago. It's a great story, and I preface it a little bit in the early chapters. While we were doing the training thing, the Battle of Britain begins, and King says, are you okay? Are you going to manage? And Churchill says, we will manage. We have enough pilots here now. You keep that training plan pumping out top-line pilots, flight engineers, navigators, radio operators, gunners, riggers, fitters, instrument technicians, and they clog the pipeline to Britain, and ultimately, in Churchill's words, become the decisive factor in determining the war. But the Battle of Britain is the first last stand.
The first last stand. You gave the numbers a few moments ago. There is no way in the world this relatively small number of RAF fighters and RCAF fighters and the others who participated, there's no way they should have prevailed in this war against overwhelming odds and German soldiers.
You're exactly right.
So how did they?
A number of things. It's funny, as I've begun to talk to you and others about this after the writing of the book, I have a real sense that Canadians left a very deep impression on this battle. All those guys who went into the RAF were sort of being shoehorned into RAF models. They all looked the same with the spiffy caps and the ribbons and the wings and the sharp aviation suits and so on. But the Canadians brought to the picnic something different. They'd come from Saskatchewan, where they'd been, doing barnstorming or, mail delivery or things that were really rudimentary and were the origin of where they came from. So they come to this battle. Let me give you a quick example. Ernie McNabb comes from Roster in Saskatchewan. Goes to school, Sunday school one day wearing a kilt because he's a McNabb and his parents want him to wear the kilt. And he takes taunting until he punches a guy with one punch, flattens him, and that was the end of the taunting. Ernie stays in the Air Force, actually evolves with, in spite of all the cuts I've referred to, emerges as the squadron leader of RCF number 1. But on the way, he's given the job of heading up the RCAF aerobatics team. And in the summer of 1934-5, somewhere in there, CNE, Canadian National Exhibition, says, hey, we've invited the Americans in their Curtiss Hawks to do all kinds of aerobatics over the shoreline and over Toronto. Is the RCAF interested in participating? Ernie says, you bet we are. And they come up with this weird stunt. They take Siskin aircraft, biplanes, which were then fighter aircraft, leading edge, and they take them up about 8,000 or 10,000 feet, and together in 3 formation, these 3 guys, a guy named Harding, McEwen, and McNabb, throw their planes into uncontrollable downward spins together. And then about 4,000 or 5,000 feet, they come out of the spins together, reform, and it's a great stunt. That kind of stunting, that kind of skill, that kind of inherent understanding of wearing an aircraft, I'm sure served Ernie McNabb well in the dogfights. And he became the squadron leader that we celebrate in helping to win that battle. So these little things were the things that made the difference. The other thing, of course, was from the top down. Hugh Dowding was the chief marshal of the Royal Air Force Fighter Command. His job was to keep the fighters away from the German fighters. He didn't want a battle of attrition. You get one, we get one. You get one, we get one. Because they were outnumbered 3-1, the RAF was. The trick was to go after the bombers and Dowding wants the fighters to do that, knock as many of them down. We can't knock them all down. Bombers will always get through, he says. But the idea was to concentrate on the bombers, not be drawn away by the Messerschmitts and so on, and win the battle by destroying the Luftwaffe bombers, which they ultimately do.
I'm going to give you another name here, Duncan Hewitt. He was the first Canadian casualty in the Battle of Britain. What do we know about how he died?
Well, he, like the Ernie McNabb I just described to you, falls in love with flying as a kid in St. John, New Brunswick. And there's a little community on the edge of St. John known as Milledgeville. And that's where the one hangar, one gypsy moth operation flying school was. And Duncan falls in love with flying, gets enough money to get lessons, and he qualifies really, really well with his pilot's license. He's one of the first. He went to Rothay's Collegiate in St. John, and he's the first kid in Rothay Collegiate to get a private pilot's license in about maybe 32 or 33. And he's drawn into this idea of going overseas. Gets a direct entry commission, ends up with 501 Squadron. He's early in the war because he joins many of the RAF Advanced Air Striking Force defending France before the Battle of Britain. And he has his greatest day on May the 26th when he shoots down a Messerschmitt 110. London Illustrated News catches him when they're retreating out of France, gets the story. Pathé makes a bit of film about him. The film arrives back in St. John, and suddenly he's a hero, right? And all that heroics, really, but he's very realistic about it. He says, this is a long haul. I don't know what's going to happen to me. If I'm captured or killed, Air Ministry will be in touch with you, he says to his folks. And his folks see the Pathé film in St. John and realize what a hero he is. But ultimately, the numbers catch up. And on July the 12th, in a dogfight over the Channel, now defending Britain, as they all were at that point, he's shot down, and he wasn't killed in the destruction of his Hurricane. He ends up in the Channel, and the British had not ramped up sufficiently their ability to retrieve airmen who'd been shot down over the Channel, and Hewitt's body is found later. He died of exposure.
For those who are listening to us or watching us in northwestern Ontario, you've got to tell us about the contribution made by what today we call Thunder Bay. Back then it was Fort William. The contribution they made to the successful prosecution of the Battle of Britain.
I wouldn't have thought this had happened in a million years, but it's a great story. Because the Hawker Hurricane, which is the principal fight, so is the Spitfire, but the Hurricane principally is in such great demand. And because Lord Beaverbrook, who we may get to later, wants as many factories, not just in Britain, but elsewhere, to be building these things, the Air Ministry gives Canadian Car and Foundry, a manufacturing plant at Fort William. They're making buses and train cars and tractors and stuff. They get a contract to build 40 Hurricanes in Fort William. So they ship the parts over. And who rises to the top of the pile of engineers to assume the control of the building of these things but a woman named Elsie McGill. She's from Vancouver. She's the first woman at the University of Toronto to get an electronic engineering degree, the first woman in North America to get an aeronautical engineering degree from the University of Michigan after battling polio. She goes to
Keep going. There's one more. First woman postdoctoral at MIT.
That's right.
I mean, she's brilliant.
She is.
She is brilliant.
And the engineering industry recognizes her, and so does Canadian Car. And so they get her to come up and head the crew that's assembling the aircraft. And she's savvy. She knows aircraft. She knows performance and design. And she speaks about it. Chatelaine magazine, big magazine in those years, interviews her. And she's got a platform to talk about women in aviation and this critical job of getting Hurricanes to Britain, which she does. They're shipped over the same as those guys. On the 7th of June, the Duchess of Atholl leaves Halifax with Elsie's 40 Hurricanes contained, and they arrive in time for the Battle of Britain.
Fantastic. Lord Beaverbrook, let's come back to him. He's a Canadian in the British government. What's his job?
He's a sticky character, as you, I'm sure, know from your research and interviews elsewhere. His motto was, Organization is the enemy of improvisation. He was one of those people who was an industrialist to the nth degree, demanded the most of everybody he had in his employ. Whether you were working in a newspaper, as was his first interest in New Brunswick, and a whole chain of newspapers. He moves to Britain in 1910, gets elected as an independent MP. Churchill realizes his skill as an industrialist and gives him the job of being the Minister of Aircraft Production. So Spitfires and Hurricanes have to be the top priority. And where leading up to the Battle of Britain in the middle of 1940, all of the projected numbers of Spitfires and Hurricanes, somewhere around 200 a month, are never being met. When he takes over in May, instead of producing 200 Spitfires and Hurricanes in May, they produce 300, the factories that he's controlling. Instead of 300, they produce 400. And so the flow of aircraft from this man, this industrialist with his Canadian background, it turns the tide. And then the other thing he does is not just having the regular obvious factories, which were of course targets for the Luftwaffe to bomb, build these Spitfires and Hurricanes. He creates a network of shadow factories hidden in the hinterland of Britain and little old Fort William way off in Canada to help supply the aircraft from unexpected sources, and they're called shadow factories. He was a brilliant statistician and very demanding, and I love Churchill's line about him when he was sort of, after the war, they were still fast friends, and Churchill said, most people take drugs, I take Max.
His real name was Max Aitken. Yeah. Here's a quote from your book. Okay, let's bring this up, shall we, Sheldon? This is Johnny Kent, quoted in the Battle of Britain. The extraordinary difference, he said, between the First World War and this one, Kent wrote, was that in the first you had to fight like hell to keep out of it, while in this one you had to fight like hell to get into it. What does that mean?
Well, in the First World War, if you could dodge a bullet by keeping your head down and out of trouble and out of the front line, that's what he's alluding to. But he had a circuitous route. He's one of the 118 who make their way into the RAF through disparate means, gets his private pilot's license in Winnipeg with thanks to a guy named Connie Johansson, who was a First World War pilot, instructs him, gets his private pilot's license, gets on a cattle boat, gets to England, Johnny Kent does, gets his commission, and then they ship him off doing all kinds of odds and ends. He wants to fight, but they send him to the Royal Aircraft Establishment, which means he's a test pilot. And he's told to test the efficiency of barrage balloons. These are large dirigibles lined up along the coast of Britain, tethered to block low-level attacks of potential German bombing in the early part of the war. You have to test them, they say. Well, how do you test them but crash into them? He does 300 controlled, successful collisions with barrage balloons and gets an Air Force Cross, goes to Buckingham Palace. George VI pins it on his chest, and then he says, you're on your way. Well, then they send him off to do photo reconnaissance in a Spitfire that's been stripped down. It's got no metal plating around the cockpit. The radio's not in this one. The guns are gone, so it's lighter and can get to high altitudes. And Kent does the first photography of the German movement towards Poland in 1939 and brings that back. But he wants to fight. So finally, as the Battle of Britain begins, they send him off to his first combat position as flight commander of number 303 RAF All-Polish Fighter Squadron. All Polish airmen who've fled from Poland, they don't speak any English. And he's been given the job of training these guys. Now, the Poles aren't stupid. It's not that they can't fly, it's that they can't fly British aircraft yet. You know, they were used to using liters and kilometers in Britain, or in Europe. In Britain, it's miles and gallons. And if you don't know the number of gallons you got in your plane, you're in trouble. But the Poles had real trouble with retractable undercarriage. When a Spitfire Hurricane takes off, the wheels come up into the belly. And of course, in reverse, when you're coming, well, the Poles kept landing them on their belly. They forgot to deploy the landing gear. So Kent's given the job of training these guys, not to kill, because they had already that inert skill from the battles they'd fought over Poland in 1939. They just had to do it in Spitfires and Hurricanes, and he does it. And his growing into the Polish mindset helps Kent become an ace in the Battle of Britain, and also gives him a stronger understanding of what the Poles lost and what the Canadians had to learn.
The Poles got screwed at the end of this war, Ted.
They did.
They lost 29 fighters. They were significant to the successful prosecution of the Battle of Britain.
126 enemy aircraft shot down in 42 days.
And what happened at the end of the war when it came time for a celebration to be planned? They weren't invited. Why not?
The then Prime Minister Attlee has just negotiated with Joseph Stalin at the end of the Second World War to take Poland into the Soviet Union. So Poland is literally occupied again. And Attlee doesn't want to offend Stalin, so he doesn't invite the Poles to the victory parade on May the 8th, 1946. The Canadians, the Brits, the New Zealanders, Australians, all the Commonwealth aircrew who've fought the battle alongside, shoulder to shoulder with the Poles, say, if the Poles don't march, we don't march. Attlee changes his mind, offers 25 invitations, the Poles decline, and the march goes ahead. But it's a typical example of our condescending way of dealing with the colonials, the non-Brits. And that was a horrible attitude that persisted right through to the victory parade.
Okay, we can't talk about the Battle of Britain without giving this guy his due. Sheldon, I think we have a clip of Winston Churchill standing by. Let's roll it, please.
Let us, therefore, brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
22 books later, would you say this is Britain's finest hour?
It certainly was the most important first one. There were lots of finest hours. That's the other funny thing about this story, because it happened so early in 1940, there's a whole lot of war yet to go, but another 1,700 days. And so it drifts into the rearview mirror bit by bit by bit, and so do the few. So I like to suggest that this certainly was Canada's first finest hour, with these young men doing what they did, men and women, Elsie and so on. They're an extraordinary generation, as we've been taught to say, but this is evidence, this is proof that they stepped up, the Brits with their stiff upper lip, and the Canadians with that imprint on this battle that's unique.
Beautiful. You've done it again, sir.
Thank you.
Well done. Battle of Britain, Canadian airmen in their finest hour. That's Ted Barris. Thanks, Ted.
Pleasure.
And that is the agenda for Monday, November 11th, 2024. We hope you had a meaningful Remembrance Day. Tomorrow on the program, we examine how technology such as artificial intelligence are influencing the battle for geopolitical dominance. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
We are where you are. TVO's current affairs journalism is available across platforms across Ontario, on Roku, Amazon Fire, Apple TV, and more. Catch The Agenda, The Thread, On Poly, and other podcasts, docs, and video series on the device of your choice when you choose.